everybody, and welcome to my cluttered garage. Today I'm going to be building some frames, so I thought this would be a good time to get a little video and show you how my construction techniques have been updated. A couple years ago I posted a video sharing about how I build beehive frames for the Layens hives. At that time some of my building techniques were maybe a little bit crude and not really geared towards mass production because I was just building as a hobbyist beekeeper. Well, now I'm building frames in larger quantities in order to sell them. So I've had to improve my construction techniques basically so that I can build more frames with more consistency of the frames and more quality of the product. I got some video a few months ago that I'm going to include in this to show some of the background details, and I mentioned that it's older video because today it's in the 80s, and you may notice in some of this video I'm wearing a sweatshirt. So that's the reason for the odd wardrobe change. I'm starting out with my frame jig that I've been using since I started. This was built based on the plans on Dr. Leo's website. The jig I showed in my original video is this same one. The only change I made to it is that I drilled a couple holes, not all the way through, but just indentations into the board here, because this is where the side bars come together with the top bar. And when I glue those together, as glue drips out of those corners, if I didn't have these holes, that glue would just be on the flat surface here. And eventually that builds up and has to be scraped off. By drilling into the wood there, I was able to make little cups to collect that glue, so I didn't have to worry about that cleanup or the surface becoming irregular as that glue built up. We'll start with the side bars, and I make the side bars from 2x12 lumber, or sometimes 2x10 lumber, depending on what I can find. I do use construction grade lumber, so I try to pick through that lumber to get the pieces I can find that are most clear with the fewest knots. And if that's a 2x10 piece, then I'll get 2x10. If it's 2x12, I'll get 2x12. For those who are unfamiliar with US dimensional lumber, when I say a 2x12, that means 2 inches by 12 inches, but not really. 2-inch thick lumber, the actual nominal thickness is 1.5 inches. And so the 12-inch width is not entirely 12 inches, but that's just the way the lumber is labeled. Because I'm dealing with construction grade lumber, the surfaces are not always smooth or even. So I start by cutting the boards down to the length I need for the side bars. Then I take those pieces that I've cut and I plane them down to thickness. The top bars for the Layens frames are 1.5 inches in thickness, and I actually usually cut mine just slightly under that. So maybe about 1/32 of an inch narrower than that. When I plane these boards down, I want the thickness at the top of this end bar to be slightly less than what I'll have for my top bars. And the reason for that is because I don't want those end bars sticking out beyond the top bar. I want them either flush or slightly narrower. So when I plane these, I will plane it maybe down to 1 7/16 inches, or just a little more than that. I try not to go more than 1/16 under 1.5 inches. I want fairly narrow tolerances. Once I have those boards planed to thickness, then I take the board and I cut it into 3/8 inch strips. And one thing I've learned for those of you who are going to be building your own frames is after you cut those strips, set them aside and let them dry for several days. Because once you cut those strips, you're going to be releasing the tension off of them, and you're going to find that some of those strips, as they fully dry, are going to warp. So rather than go through the trouble of shaping your end bars and then finding that you have a whole bunch of warped end bars, better to let those blanks warp, and you can discard those as you're doing your shaping. Once those blanks have dried and done any warping that they're going to do, then I will go ahead and shape them. Now if you watched the previous video, you saw that my method of shaping those boards was to set up dado blades on my table saw, and I had a jig that I made that I could feed those boards through to cut that taper with the dado blade. That dado blade made a nice taper, but it took me quite a bit of time to change my saw over to cut those tapers. So to save time, I got myself a router table that I have set up full time just for the dedicated purpose of shaping these end bars. So I take those blanks that I've cut and I feed them through my router table and use the router to cut the narrow end of those bars, making my taper. And then as I make the frames, I start by taking two of my end bars, put them on each side, and I'll take a look along this edge and make sure it seems fairly straight along there. I don't mind if there is just a little bit of warp in that board. I usually give up to 1/8 of an inch warp, which 1/8 it can be quite a bit, so sometimes if it's up to that much, I'll toss those out. But I can see here on this one, it's touching at the top, touching at the bottom, and there is maybe a 32 of an inch gap in there, maybe a little less. So that does not look too bad. And I kind of checked that on both sides. If there is any warp, I want that warp to come in rather than out, because if it goes out, that's going to affect the bee space between those end bars and the sides of the swarm trap or the hive. Whereas if it tapers in, then it is going to simply take a little bit of space out of the inside of that frame, and that's more tolerable in my mind. So I set those in there, and then my little trick, I bring the tops of those together. So I make a triangle. So that gives me space. When I bring in my bottom bar, I can just set it right in there. So I put it there to show you kind of how it fits in there nicely, make space for it between those bars. But before I put that bottom bar in place, I'm going to glue it up. The wood glue is the important part of this assembly. Don't forget your glue. Once I put that board in there, I straighten those out. That puts pressure here on the ends and will spread that wood glue on the end. Then I turn my jig around and I'm ready to put on my top bar. And as I got that bottom bar, I want to mention real quick about how I make those. The bottom bars are just cut from 1x lumber. So a 1x10 or 1x12, whatever nice clear boards I can find. It's important with the bottom bars not to have any knots throughout that bar. A knot in that bottom bar will cause a broken bar when you come to wiring it. So I want nice clear bottom bars. And so I take that 1x lumber, I cut it to length, and then run it through my table saw to cut it down to 5/8 inch thickness. Now again, just like the 2x lumber is 1.5 inches thick, 1x lumber is not actually 1 inch thick. It's actually 3/4 inch thick. So that's 3/4 of an inch, and then I cut it to 5/8 of an inch. Then I drill through the wide side using the same drill jig that I've been using forever that I demonstrated in my last video, drilling 4 holes along that board. So my jig that I use is real simple. It's just got markings on it where I line the end of the board up with the markings. I have 4 markings on there. Line the end up, drill, move it over, drill, move it over, drill. That's all done on my drill press. The drill press is invaluable. It would be very difficult to make these consistently and repeatably if I was trying to drill it by hand. Now I have the bottom bar in place and I'm going to put the top bar in place. But before I do, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I make these. Again, this is 1x lumber, so it's 3/4 inch thick. I will get boards that are 1x10 or 1x12, whatever is the most clear. But for these top bars, it's not as critical to be clear of any knots. If you have a knot in the top bar, it could lead to warping as that wood completely dries, so that's something that I watch for. But otherwise, I'm not too concerned about a knot in these top bars. I go to a big box store to get my lumber, and while the 2x lumber is construction grade, the 1x lumber is typically more for woodworking projects. So it's generally a little nicer lumber, a little smoother on the sides. And because of that, I don't have to plane this lumber to thickness. I just cut the boards to length, and then I will run them through my table saw to cut the width of that blank. The top bars are, by the plans, 1.5 inches wide. I will typically cut them just slightly under that, not down to 1 inch and 7/16. I usually try to keep it within a 32nds of an inch, but just under 1.5 inches. Now there are some people who have said 1 inch and 3/8 would be a better width for the frame bars, and if you want to make some that are 1 inch and 3/8, that's fine. I've thought about making some and playing with that. I thought it might be better for the brood frames. It's just not something that I have gotten around to doing, to be honest. I have those blanks cut, and then something I do on my frames is that I take each of the frames, and while it's a blank, I cut a groove down the middle. That groove is not very big. It may be 1/8 of an inch deep and about the width of the blade. So about 1/8 of an inch or a little narrower depending on the kerf or the thickness of your blade. And the reason I cut those grooves is so that once this frame is assembled and somebody is putting foundation in there, that groove can serve as a guide to keep that foundation straight. When the wires are through there, then you can push that foundation in next to the wire. It'll hold it in place until you get that foundation mounted to the wires. Alternately, if somebody doesn't want to use foundation, and this is something that I have experimented with on some of my frames, is I've taken craft sticks and glued them into that groove and used those as a starter strip. And that has worked. I think a 5/8 inch craft stick was a little wide. I might try with something a little narrower because the bees would kind of tend to build to one side or the other rather than on the center. So I think something that would just give a little bit of a ridge along that middle to give the bees a starting point but not encourage them to build on one side. That's something I'm still working on, but I still think the groove is a valuable addition to these frames. As far as the ends, this was kind of a tricky part, and something that I got some criticism with on my previous video is cutting the notch out of those ends. And in the past I was just kind of freehanding, holding the board upright on my table saw and to cut out one way and then flat to cut out the other way. I've made a sled that I can put multiple blanks on in order to make the first cut, or the flat cut. So I lay the bars on my sled and push the sled through, and it'll make a cut through that board. I have it marked on my sled so I don't forget how deep I need to set the blade to make a 3/8 inch cut through that board. And then I have another sled that actually holds the bars upright, and the pieces that get cut out just fall away. So once I have made those cuts, I end up with my top bar, and the only thing left to do is then to put my brand on the bar. I almost forgot a step that is even more important than applying my brand to the top bars, and that is drilling the holes for the wire. And this is done using the same jig as for the bottom bars. I just adjust the jig slightly to fit the wider top bars using the same marks, but instead of going by the end of the bar, I go by the cuts on the bottom of the bar. So I put a little glue on here, and when I make the cuts, you might notice that my cut goes a little farther in, so it cuts a groove basically across there. And that's not entirely intentional, but I would rather the cut go a little deep than not deep enough. If it doesn't go deep enough, I'm going to have a ridge at this junction that I'm going to have to scrape out. But if I have that groove, then that kind of acts as a glue groove there. The glue can kind of settle into it, and so I don't worry too much about that. So now that I have my parts together, it's just a matter of putting in staples. And I use 1 inch narrow crown staples, 2 in the end, one at the top. Bring this, and like I said, those end bars should be slightly narrower than the top bar. So when I am lining these up, I will lift that end bar up so there's it just sets below the level of that top bar. And that should give a little bit of gap on each side. Once those staples are in, I make sure that my bars are all pressed down in the jig. If any of them have lifted up a little bit, then that's going to make my frame crooked. So I make sure everything is pressed down, make sure my bottom bar is pressed back against this bottom bar, everything is tight. So then I pull the frame out of the jig. I check it all over, make sure that I don't have any staples blown out anywhere. And it all looks good, so it's ready to go be stacked up for drying, and then we will get these frames wired. So the frame assembly isn't complicated, but after you do it for a while, you find a few little tricks to try to make things easier. I know several people commented on my last frame assembly video saying that it was helpful for them as they made their own frames, and I'm glad for that, and I hope this is helpful too. I also had some people comment on that last video criticizing some of my techniques, and I will admit I am not a shop teacher. I am not trying to instruct people on shop safety, so I'm glad when people share helpful information that can help others to be safe. If you like this video and found it helpful and find the information I share on my channel in general useful, would you consider joining as a member of this channel? The join button is just below. If you didn't see that other video and would like to go back and see how I used to do things, I'll put that video down here and you can go back and watch that. Or you might like this other video that YouTube has selected especially for you. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.